What could make a 74-year-old librarian's hands shake as he sat before a dusty piano with 200 people holding their breath, waiting for a decision that would change everything? How did a forgotten instrument in a small-town library become the center of the most powerful healing movement Oak Ridge had ever witnessed? The scene was almost surreal. Vincent Hayes, a man who had spent 48 years organizing books in quiet solitude, now stood at the center of a packed town council meeting. The piano behind him, an instrument that had gathered dust for 2 decades, had somehow become the focal point of a debate that would determine the future of an entire community's healing. Around him, faces bore the weight of grief. Widows and widowers, parents who had buried children, children who had lost parents, veterans carrying invisible scars. Every single person in that room had come because of what had happened over the past 6 months. Because of what Vincent and that old piano had awakened in a town that had forgotten how to grieve together. But how did we get here? What series of events could transform a quiet library into a sanctuary for an entire town's hidden sorrow? To understand, we need to go back 6 months to a cold Tuesday morning in March, to the day when everything changed. Oak Ridge was the kind of small Midwestern town where everyone knew everyone else's business, yet somehow no one really knew each other's pain. Population 3,200. Main Street had the usual fixtures, a diner that served breakfast all day, a hardware store run by the same family for 3 generations, and at the corner of Oak and Maple, the Oak Ridge Public Library. The library was a modest brick building constructed in 1962 with tall windows that let in the afternoon light and made the dust particles dance in golden streams. It smelled of old paper furniture polish and that indefinable scent that only libraries seem to possess, the smell of 1,000 stories waiting to be discovered. Vincent Hayes had been the head librarian for 48 years. At 74, he was as much a fixture of the building as the circulation desk or the children's reading corner. He was a tall, lean African-American man with silver hair kept neatly trimmed, gentle brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and hands that moved with practiced care as he shelved books, helped patrons find resources, or simply sat at his desk reading. To most people in Oak Ridge, Vincent was simply the librarian. Quiet, dependable, always there with a book recommendation or a warm smile. He arrived every morning at 7:30, unlocked the heavy oak doors at 8, and rarely left before 6 in the evening. His life had a comforting rhythm, a predictable pattern that seemed to suit him perfectly. But Vincent carried something that most people in Oak Ridge never suspected. Beneath his calm exterior, beneath his gentle demeanor and patient smile, lived a grief so profound that he had spent the last 8 years carefully constructing walls around it. Walls made of routine, walls made of books, walls made of silence. In the back corner of the library's main reading room, covered by a dusty sheet and surrounded by stacks of outdated encyclopedias, sat an upright piano. It had been donated to the library 20 years earlier by the family of a music teacher who had passed away with the vague notion that it might be used for community events. But community events had never materialized, and eventually the piano had been forgotten, pushed into a corner buried under layers of dust and neglect. Vincent walked past that piano every single day, and every single day he forced himself not to look at it, not to remember, not to feel the ache that came with memories of music. This was Vincent's life. Ordered, contained, safe. Until the phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning in early March when the phone rang at the circulation desk. Vincent answered on the second ring, as was his habit. Oak Ridge Public Library. This is Vincent speaking. How may I help you? The voice on the other end was shaky, barely above a whisper. Mr. Hayes. This is Dorothy Campbell. I'm sorry to bother you. Vincent knew Dorothy, though not well. She was in her early 60s, a retired elementary school teacher who had always been pleasant during her library visits. But he hadn't seen her in several months. Dorothy, it's no trouble at all. What can I do for you? There was a long pause, and Vincent could hear her trying to steady her breathing. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush. My husband Thomas passed away 3 months ago. Heart attack. Very sudden. And I can't seem to... Everyone keeps telling me to move on, to get out of the house, to join groups and stay busy, but I just... Her voice broke. I'm so tired of pretending I'm okay. I thought maybe... Could I just come sit in the library? Somewhere quiet? I promise I won't disturb anyone. I just can't be in my house right now, and I don't know where else to go. Vincent's throat tightened. He recognized that particular quality of pain in her voice. That desperate need for a place where you didn't have to perform, didn't have to smile and assure everyone you were healing. A place where grief could simply exist without judgment. Dorothy, he said softly, you come whenever you need to. The library is here for you. In fact, he paused, an idea forming. An idea that both terrified and compelled him. Why don't you come by this afternoon around 2? I'd like to show you something. After Dorothy hung up, Vincent sat at his desk, his heart pounding. He knew what he needed to do, even though every instinct told him to leave the past buried where it belonged. He stood, walked to the back corner of the reading room, and for the first time in 8 years really looked at the piano. The sheet covering it was gray with dust. Vincent pulled it away slowly, revealing the upright's dark wood finish, dulled by years of neglect. He ran his fingers across the closed lid, leaving tracks in the dust. His hands were trembling. The memories came flooding back as he knew they would. Grace, sitting at their home piano, her fingers dancing across the keys. Daniel, their son, at age 7, struggling through his first scales. The music that had filled their home with warmth and life and joy. Before Afghanistan. Before the cancer. Before Vincent had learned that a heart could break so thoroughly that even breathing became an act of will. Grace had been gone for 8 years, taken by breast cancer 3 months after Daniel's death. Their son, their only child, had died at 24, killed by an IED while serving with his unit outside Kandahar. The grief had been so massive, so all-consuming that Vincent had stopped playing music entirely. He couldn't bear it. Every note was a reminder of what he'd lost. But now, standing in front of this forgotten piano, listening to the echo of Dorothy's broken voice in his mind, Vincent understood something with sudden clarity. His grief had taught him something valuable, something he could offer. Not answers, not platitudes, but presence, understanding, a space where pain didn't have to be hidden. He spent the next 2 hours cleaning the piano. He removed years of dust, polished the wood, carefully cleaned each key. When he lifted the lid and pressed middle C, he half expected silence or a discordant clang. Instead, the note rang out clear and pure, filling the empty library with sound. The piano was old, certainly. Out of tune, definitely. But it worked. And more importantly, Vincent realized, with a mixture of fear and hope, so did his hands. After 8 years of silence, his fingers remembered the movements. They remembered how to find the keys. They remembered how to create music. When Dorothy arrived at 2 o'clock, her eyes red and swollen from crying, Vincent was waiting by the piano. He had arranged 2 comfortable chairs nearby, away from the main reading area, creating a small, private space. "Thank you for coming," he said gently. "I thought, sometimes words aren't enough for what we're feeling. Sometimes we need something else." He gestured to the piano. "Would you mind if I played something?" Dorothy looked surprised, but nodded, sinking into one of the chairs. Vincent sat at the piano bench, his heart racing. He hadn't played for another person in 8 years, but he thought of Grace, of the way music had always been her comfort, her joy. And he began to play. The piece was simple, a gentle melody that Grace had loved. His fingers were rusty, and he missed notes here and there, but the music filled the space around them. Soft, tender, a sound that didn't demand anything, didn't try to fix anything. It simply existed, a companion to grief, rather than a cure for it. When he finished, Vincent looked over at Dorothy. Tears were streaming down her face, but her shoulders, which had been tight with tension when she arrived, had relaxed slightly. "That was beautiful," she whispered. "I haven't cried like this in weeks. Everyone keeps trying to cheer me up, to distract me, and I've been holding it all in. But this felt like permission to just feel it." Vincent nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "Would you like to sit here for a while? I can play more, or we can just sit in silence." "Whatever you need." Dorothy stayed for 2 hours that afternoon. Vincent played occasionally simple pieces that created a gentle soundscape. Sometimes they talked, sharing memories of their lost loved ones. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence. And for the first time since Thomas's death, Dorothy felt like she could breathe. As she was leaving, she turned to Vincent. Could I come back next Tuesday?" "Of course," Vincent said. "Same time." And that was how it began. Word traveled fast in a small town. By the following week, Dorothy had mentioned the piano sessions to her neighbor, who told a friend who mentioned it at the grocery store. The story transformed slightly with each telling, but the core remained the same. The librarian was playing piano for people who were grieving, and somehow it was helping. The next Tuesday, Dorothy arrived at 2 as planned. But she wasn't alone. Behind her stood Lucas Rivera, a 28-year-old construction worker with calloused hands and tired eyes. "I hope you don't mind," Dorothy said apologetically. "Lucas lost his father 2 months ago. Work accident. When I told him about what you did for me last week, he asked if he could come." Vincent looked at Lucas, seeing the same barely contained pain he recognized in himself in Dorothy. "Of course," he said simply. "Everyone is welcome." Lucas nodded his thanks, but didn't speak. He sat heavily in one of the chairs, his large frame seeming almost too big for the furniture, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. Vincent played again. The same gentle melodies, nothing complicated or showy, just honest, simple music that filled the space between words. After about 20 minutes, Lucas began to cry. Not dramatic sobs, but silent tears that ran down his face as his body shook slightly. Dorothy reached over and placed her hand on his arm, offering wordless comfort. When the session ended, Lucas finally spoke, his voice rough. "My dad taught me everything I know about construction, about being a man, about taking care of your family. I don't know how to do this without him. I don't know how to be in the world when he's not in it anymore." "I know," Vincent said quietly. "I lost my son 15 years ago. My wife 8 years ago. I still don't have all the answers. But I've learned that grief doesn't have a timeline, and healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to carry the love and the loss together. Something shifted in the room then. A recognition. A connection between three people who had been carrying their pain alone and had suddenly found others who understood. The following Tuesday, there were 5 people. Dorothy and Lucas returned, and they brought others. Betty Anderson, a 52-year-old nurse who had lost her mother to Alzheimer's the previous year. Frank Morrison, a widower in his 70s, whose wife had passed away peacefully in her sleep 6 months earlier. And Sarah, a 16-year-old girl, whose older brother had died in a car accident. Vincent didn't advertise. He didn't make announcements or put up flyers. But every Tuesday at 2 o'clock, the back corner of the Oak Ridge Public Library became a sanctuary for grief. Vincent played piano sometimes for the full 2 hours, sometimes in shorter pieces with long silences in between. People shared stories if they wanted to, or they sat quietly if they didn't. There were no rules, no structure, no agenda. Just presence. Just music. Just the quiet acknowledgement that grief deserved a space where it didn't have to hide. By the 6th week, there were 12 regular attendees. The group had developed its own gentle rhythm. People arrived, found their seats, and waited for Vincent to begin playing. Sometimes he chose classical pieces. Sometimes he played old hymns or folk songs. Occasionally, someone would request a song that their lost loved one had enjoyed, and Vincent would do his best to play it even if he had to work through it haltingly, finding the melody as he went. The library's Tuesday afternoons had become something sacred, something necessary. But not everyone in Oak Ridge saw it that way. Preston Whitmore was 60 years old, successful, and possessed the kind of rigid certainty that comes from a life spent making decisions and expecting them to be followed. As a member of the Oak Ridge Town Council and the Library Board, he took his civic responsibilities seriously. Very seriously. When he first heard about the piano sessions at the library, he dismissed it as a harmless eccentricity. Let the old librarian play his piano. It wasn't hurting anyone. But by late April, the sessions had grown. 20 people were now showing up every Tuesday. The back corner of the library was becoming crowded, and Preston began to hear complaints. Mrs. Henderson, who liked to do her genealogy research on Tuesday afternoons, complained that the music was distracting. Mr. Chen, wait, that wouldn't work with the naming constraints. Let me revise Mr. Patterson, who preferred absolute silence when reading, grumbled that the library was turning into something other than what it should be. More concerning to Preston were the questions about liability. What if someone had an emotional breakdown during one of these sessions? What if the piano was damaged? What if this was some kind of unlicensed therapy that could expose the library to legal risk? Preston decided to visit the library on a Tuesday afternoon to see for himself what was happening. What he found disturbed him, though not for the reasons he expected. The scene was peaceful, almost reverent. About 22 people sat in chairs arranged in a loose semicircle around the old upright piano. Vincent sat at the piano bench, his long fingers moving across the keys, producing a gentle melody that filled the space. And as Preston watched from a distance, he saw something that made his jaw tighten. People were crying. Not everyone, but several. Dorothy Campbell had tears streaming down her face. That Rivera kid, the one who had taken over his father's construction business, had his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. Even old Frank Morrison, who Preston had always thought was tough as nails, sat with his eyes closed and moisture on his weathered cheeks. This wasn't library business. This was something else. Something that made Preston deeply uncomfortable. When the session ended and people began to disperse, Preston approached Vincent. "Mr. Hayes, I'd like a word." Vincent looked up from closing the piano lid, his expression calm but guarded. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. What can I do for you? What exactly is going on here?" Preston gestured to the chairs, the piano, the space that had clearly been transformed into something beyond a reading area. "This is a public library, not a therapy center." Vincent straightened slightly, meeting Preston's eyes. "I'm playing piano for people who are grieving. We're not disrupting other patrons. We're using a corner of the library that's rarely occupied. And we're not charging money or claiming to provide any kind of professional service. But this isn't what libraries are for," Preston insisted. "Libraries are for books, for research, for educational programs, not for whatever this is. With respect, Mr. Whitmore, libraries have always been about more than just books. They're community spaces, safe spaces. And these people need a safe space where their grief is acknowledged rather than rushed or ignored." Preston's expression hardened. "I understand you have good intentions, Mr. Hayes, but good intentions don't protect us from liability. What if someone has a medical emergency during one of these sessions? What if the emotional content becomes too intense? What if parents object to their children being exposed to this level of sadness? Then we'll handle those situations as they arise," Vincent said quietly. "But we can't let fear of what might happen prevent us from doing what's clearly helping people right now." Preston shook his head. "I'm going to be bringing this up at the next library board meeting. I think we need clear policies about appropriate uses of library space. And I don't think this qualifies." As Preston walked away, Vincent felt a cold dread settle in his chest. He had known this moment would come eventually. He had known that someone would object, would question, would try to stop what was happening. He just hadn't expected it to happen so soon, when the healing had only just begun. That evening, Vincent called Dorothy and explained the situation. Within hours, she had contacted everyone in the Tuesday group. By the next morning, Vincent's phone was ringing steadily with messages of support. But support alone wouldn't be enough if the library board decided to shut down the sessions. Preston Whitmore was influential, and when he made up his mind about something, he rarely backed down. The library board meeting was scheduled for mid-May, 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to prepare. 3 weeks to figure out how to defend something that shouldn't need defending, the simple act of creating space for human pain. Over the next few weeks, the Tuesday sessions continued, but they were shadowed by uncertainty. People came grateful for the space Vincent had created, but worried about losing it. Vincent played, but his mind was constantly working, trying to figure out what he could say that would make the board understand. How do you explain to people who haven't experienced profound loss what it means to have a place where grief doesn't have to perform? How do you quantify the value of shared tears, of quiet understanding of music that doesn't try to fix but simply accompanies? Meanwhile, Preston was busy too. He was compiling a list of concerns, researching library policies from other municipalities, and preparing a formal proposal for the board meeting. A proposal that would establish clear boundaries for library programming and would effectively end Vincent's piano sessions. The tension in Oak Ridge was building. Lines were being drawn, and a small-town library was about to become the center of a debate about grief community and what we owe to each other in our darkest moments. Despite the looming threat of the board meeting, Vincent refused to cancel the Tuesday sessions. If anything, they became more important, more precious, because everyone knew they might be numbered. The group had grown to nearly 30 people now. They came from all walks of life, united only by loss. And as the weeks passed, something remarkable began to happen. The sessions evolved from individual grief into collective healing. Dorothy, who had been so broken when she first called Vincent, began to share not just her pain, but her memories. She told stories about Thomas, how he used to burn pancakes every Sunday morning, but refused to give up trying, how he sang off-key in the shower, how he had proposed to her at a county fair, getting down on one knee right in front of the Ferris wheel. I was afraid to talk about him, she admitted during one session. Afraid that if I started, I wouldn't be able to stop crying. But now I realize that not talking about him was like losing him twice. These memories, these stories, they're all I have left. And they deserve to be spoken out loud. Lucas, the quiet construction worker, began to open up about his father. My dad was tough, he said one Tuesday. Old school, didn't talk much about feelings, but he taught me everything through actions. How to measure twice and cut once. How to take pride in your work. How to show up every day even when you don't feel like it. His voice broke slightly. I keep wanting to call him when I run into a problem on a job site. I'll actually pull out my phone before I remember, and every time I remember it's like losing him all over again. Betty, the nurse, shared about her mother's long decline with Alzheimer's. The worst part, she said, was losing her slowly, piece by piece, until the person in front of me looked like my mother but didn't remember who I was. I mourned her for years before she actually died. And then when she finally passed, everyone said things like, "At least she's at peace now," or "It's a blessing she's not suffering." And yes, those things are true, but I'm still allowed to miss her. I'm still allowed to be sad. Vincent listened to all of them playing gentle melodies that created a sonic backdrop for their stories. And eventually, as the trust in the group deepened, he began to share his own story more fully. My son Daniel was 24 when he died, Vincent said during a session in early May. Killed in Afghanistan. IED. We got the visit from the officers, and I remember thinking that it couldn't be real, that there had been some mistake, that my son, my brilliant, kind, funny son, couldn't just be gone. He paused, his hands resting on the piano keys. And then 3 months later, my wife Grace was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. She had been ignoring symptoms, putting off seeing a doctor because she was so consumed with grief over Daniel. By the time they caught it, it was too late. She died less than 3 months after that. The room was completely silent. I lost my entire family in 6 months. Vincent continued, his voice steady but quiet. And for years afterward, I couldn't understand why I was still here, why I had to keep breathing when they didn't. I stopped playing music because every song reminded me of them. I built my life into the smallest possible space, just work, just routine, just survival. Because anything more than that hurt too much. He looked around at the faces watching him. But these sessions, being here with all of you, have reminded me of something important. Grief isn't something to get over. It's something to integrate, to carry. And we were never meant to carry it alone. Dorothy reached over and squeezed his hand. Lucas nodded, his eyes bright with tears. Betty wiped her cheeks. They weren't just a group anymore. They were becoming a community. As spring turned toward summer, the Tuesday sessions developed new rituals. Someone brought cookies to share. Someone else started bringing flowers from their garden. They arrived early to help Vincent set up chairs. They stayed late to talk in small groups, exchanging phone numbers, making plans to check on each other during the week. Young Sarah, the 16-year-old who had lost her brother, found a motherly figure in Betty. Frank Morrison and Lucas discovered they both loved fishing and started going together on weekends. Dorothy organized a potluck dinner at her house for the whole group. The piano sessions had sparked something larger than any of them had anticipated. People who had been isolated in their grief were connecting. People who had felt invisible in their pain were being seen. And that old upright piano, once forgotten in a dusty corner, had become the heart around which a community was forming. But hanging over all of this growth, all of this connection, was the knowledge that it might all end in just a few weeks. The board meeting loomed, and Preston Whitmore was not a man who changed his mind easily. Vincent noticed something strange during the second week of May. Preston had shown up at the library during a Tuesday session, but instead of confronting anyone or taking notes, he simply sat in the back, partially hidden behind a shelf. He stayed for about 30 minutes, watching silently, and then left, without saying a word. Vincent didn't know what to make of it. Was Preston gathering evidence for his case? Or was something else happening? When Vincent mentioned it to Dorothy, she frowned thoughtfully. "Preston lost his wife about 2 years ago," she said quietly. "Catherine. Cancer. But he's never talked about it, never showed any grief publicly, just threw himself into work and town business. Maybe..." She trailed off. Maybe what Vincent prompted. Maybe seeing all of us being open about our grief is harder for him than he expected. Maybe it's not really about library policy at all. Vincent considered this. He knew all too well how threatening vulnerability could be when you'd spent years building walls around your pain. He knew how it felt to have those walls challenged. But whether Preston was struggling with his own grief, or simply committed to shutting down the sessions for procedural reasons, the result would be the same. The board meeting was in 1 week, and Vincent needed to be ready to fight for what had become so precious to so many people. The group spent their Tuesday session that week preparing. They decided that several people would speak at the board meeting, sharing what the piano sessions had meant to them. Dorothy volunteered to go first. Lucas said he would speak. Betty would talk about the mental health benefits she'd observed as a nurse, and Vincent would make the case for why libraries should be spaces that nurture community healing. As they prepared, Vincent felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope mixed with fear. The terrifying possibility that something good might actually last, balanced against the ever-present knowledge that everything precious could be lost. He played longer that Tuesday, his fingers moving across the keys with more confidence than they'd had in years. The music swelled and filled the space, and for a moment everyone in that corner of the library forgot about board meetings and policies and opposition. For a moment, there was just the music, just the community, just the shared understanding that they were holding each other up through the hardest thing any of them had ever faced. And in that moment, it was enough. The week before the board meeting felt both endless and too short. Vincent found himself unable to sleep, lying awake at night, rehearsing what he would say, imagining all the ways it could go wrong. The library board consisted of 7 members. Preston was one of them. Vincent knew 2 others who would likely be sympathetic: Carol Henderson, a retired teacher who understood the value of community programs, and David Wu. Wait, that name wouldn't work. Let me revise David Wilson, a local business owner who had lost his father the previous year and had attended 2 of the piano sessions himself, though he'd asked Vincent to keep his attendance private. That meant 3 votes, potentially, but they needed 4 to maintain the program. And the other 3 board members were unknowns. They could be swayed by Preston's arguments about liability and proper library usage, or they could be moved by testimony from the community. There was no way to know. Dorothy organized a meeting of the Tuesday group at her house the Saturday before the board meeting. Nearly 40 people showed up, not just the regular attendees, but also their family members, friends, and supporters who had heard about what was happening. "We need to be strategic," Dorothy said, standing in her living room, surrounded by people sitting on couches, chairs, and the floor. "We can't just be emotional. We need to have clear points about why this program matters and why it should continue." Lucas raised his hand. "I've been doing some research. There are libraries all over the country doing similar programs: music therapy, art therapy, grief support groups. Libraries are evolving to meet community needs beyond just books. I can present that information. Betty added, "I can speak to the mental health benefits. As a nurse, I can talk about how unprocessed grief contributes to physical health problems, depression, substance abuse, and how having a supportive community helps prevent those outcomes." Sarah, the 16-year-old, spoke up quietly. "Should I talk? I mean, would it help to have a young person's perspective?" "Yes," Vincent said immediately. "Your voice matters just as much as anyone else's." They spent 2 hours strategizing, organizing their thoughts, anticipating counterarguments. By the time people left, they had a plan. It might not be enough, but it was the best they could do. On Monday evening, the night before the board meeting, Vincent stayed late at the library. He sat at the piano in the empty building, the silence around him feeling heavy and profound. He thought about Daniel, who had been so excited to serve his country, who had believed so deeply in making a difference. He thought about Grace, who had always told him that music was meant to be shared, that beauty was meant to heal. And he thought about what the past 3 months had taught him, that grief shared was somehow more bearable than grief hidden, that community could form in the most unexpected places, that even the deepest pain could be transformed into something that connected rather than isolated. He began to play. Not the gentle melodies he usually chose for the group sessions, but something more complex. A piece Grace had loved, one he hadn't been able to play since her death. His fingers stumbled at first, finding their way through years of avoidance, but gradually the music emerged. Sad and beautiful and honest. When he finished, he sat in silence for a long moment. Then he whispered into the empty library. "I'm trying, Grace. I'm trying to do what you would have done, to share the music, to help people heal. I just hope it's enough." The next morning, Vincent arrived at the library at his usual time, but his hands were shaking as he unlocked the door. The board meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock that evening at the town hall, 12 hours away. Throughout the day, members of the Tuesday group stopped by to see him. Some brought baked goods, some just wanted to squeeze his hand and promise they'd be there. Dorothy came by 3 times, so nervous she couldn't sit still. "What if they shut us down?" she asked during her 3rd visit. "Then we'll find another way," Vincent said, with more confidence than he felt. "The community we've built that's real. It exists whether or not we have the library as a space. But I'm going to fight like hell to keep that space." At 6:30, Vincent closed the library and walked to the town hall. The meeting room, which normally held maybe 20 people for routine board business, was packed. Every seat was filled, and people lined the walls. Vincent estimated there were at least 200 people in the room. His heart swelled when he saw them. The Tuesday group, yes, but also others. Parents whose children attended the library's story time. Teenagers who used the library for homework help. Senior citizens who came for the large print book collection. People who had never attended a piano session, but understood instinctively that something worth protecting was at stake. Preston Whitmore sat at the board table, his expression unreadable. When his eyes met Vincent's, Vincent saw something flicker there. Not hostility, exactly. Something more complicated. Something that looked almost like pain. The board chair, Margaret Peterson, called the meeting to order at 7 o'clock sharp. After some routine business budget reports, facility maintenance updates, she reached the item that everyone was waiting for. Proposal by board member Preston Whitmore regarding appropriate use of library space. "Mr. Whitmore, you have the floor." Preston stood gathering his papers. He looked out at the packed room, and Vincent could see his jaw tighten. This was it. The moment that would decide everything. Preston Whitmore cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice measured and formal. "Thank you, Madam Chair. I've called for this discussion because I believe we need clear policies regarding the use of our library facilities. Over the past 3 months, Tuesday afternoons at the library have been dedicated to what I'll call an informal gathering, where Mr. Hayes, our head librarian, plays piano for community members who are experiencing grief. He paused, looking down at his notes. Let me be clear. I have no doubt that Mr. Hayes has good intentions, and I don't question that some people find these sessions helpful. However, as board members, we have responsibilities that go beyond good intentions. Preston listed his concerns methodically. Liability issues, the lack of professional oversight, questions about whether this was an appropriate use of taxpayer-funded space and a public employee's time, the potential for emotional situations that library staff weren't trained to handle. Libraries serve important functions, Preston continued. Educational functions, informational functions, recreational functions through books and media, but we are not qualified to provide mental health services, and I believe that's what these piano sessions have become, whether intentionally or not. He pulled out a document. I've drafted a proposal that would establish clear guidelines for library programming. Programs would need to be educational in nature, open to all community members, and aligned with the library's core mission. Under these guidelines, Mr. Hayes's piano sessions would not qualify as appropriate library programming. As Preston spoke, Vincent watched the faces in the crowd. Anger, sadness, disbelief. Dorothy was gripping the hand of the person next to her so tightly her knuckles were white. Lucas's jaw was clenched. Betty had tears already forming in her eyes. When Preston finished and sat down, there was a moment of heavy silence. Then Margaret Peterson spoke. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. I believe we should hear from community members before any discussion or vote. Who would like to speak first? Dorothy's hand shot up. She walked to the front of the room on slightly shaky legs and turned to face the crowd and the board. My name is Dorothy Campbell. She began, her voice stronger than Vincent expected. 3 months ago, my husband of 41 years died suddenly, and I was drowning. Not crying all the time, drowning. Worse. The kind where you're numb and can't feel anything and start to wonder what the point of continuing is. The room was absolutely silent. I called Mr. Hayes on a Tuesday morning and I asked if I could just sit in the library because I couldn't be in my house anymore. He could have said yes and left it at that. But instead he offered me something I didn't even know I needed. He played music. Simple music. And for the first time since Thomas died, I felt like I had permission to actually feel my grief, instead of performing being okay for everyone around me. Dorothy's voice grew stronger. Mr. Whitmore talks about liability and appropriate use of space. But what about the liability of a community that doesn't support its grieving members? What about the cost, the real human cost, of people suffering in isolation because we've decided that grief belongs behind closed doors? She looked directly at Preston. The library has always been about more than books. It's about community. It's about creating space for people to grow and learn and connect. And grief is part of the human experience. Learning to navigate it, learning that we're not alone in it, that's as valuable as any educational program. Dorothy sat down to quiet applause. Lucas stood next. I'm Lucas Rivera, he said. I lost my father 2 months ago in a work accident. He was a contractor and I took over his business. Every single day, I face situations where I wish I could ask his advice, where I wish I could hear his voice telling me I'm doing okay. Lucas's voice was rough with emotion. I'm 28 years old. Most people expect me to just tough it out. Be strong, be the man. But Vincent's piano sessions taught me that strength isn't about hiding your pain. It's about being honest about it, being willing to sit with it. And the community that's formed around those Tuesday afternoons, Those people have kept me going when I wasn't sure I could." He looked at the board. "You want to talk about what libraries are for? Libraries are for people. And people grieve. Shutting down a program that's helping people heal because it doesn't fit a narrow definition of library services that's not protecting the library. That's betraying what libraries are supposed to be." Betty spoke next, framing her testimony in clinical terms. She talked about the research on grief support groups, the mental health benefits of music therapy, the dangers of complicated grief and social isolation. She spoke as a nurse who had seen firsthand what happened when people didn't have healthy outlets for their pain. Sarah, the 16-year-old, stood last among the planned speakers. Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the silent room. "My brother died in a car accident when I was 15, she said. He was 18. And everyone at school treated me like I was broken, like I might shatter if they mentioned his name, or they avoided me completely because they didn't know what to say. I felt invisible, like the most important thing that had ever happened to me was something no one wanted to acknowledge." She looked at Vincent. "But at the library on Tuesdays, I didn't feel invisible. I could talk about my brother. I could cry. I could be sad without people trying to cheer me up or change the subject. And I learned that grief is normal, that it's okay, that I'm not broken, I'm just human." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I'm only 16, so maybe my voice doesn't matter as much. But this program saved me. It literally saved me from feeling completely alone in the world. And if you shut it down, you're telling every grieving kid in this town that their pain isn't important enough to deserve space." The room erupted in applause as Sarah sat down. Margaret Peterson had to gavel for order. Then something happened that no one expected. Preston Whitmore stood again. "Madam Chair, if I may," he said quietly. Margaret nodded, looking surprised. Preston turned to face the crowd, and Vincent could see that his hands were shaking slightly. "I've sat here listening to these testimonies," Preston began, his voice different now, less formal, more raw. "And I need to say something I should have said 2 years ago, something I've been avoiding saying because I thought if I ignored it hard enough it would hurt less." He took a deep breath. "My wife Catherine died 2 years ago. Ovarian cancer. We had 34 years together and then she was gone. And His voice cracked. "I couldn't handle it. So I did what I've always done when faced with emotions I can't control. I worked. I threw myself into town business, into being productive, into doing anything except sitting with the pain of losing her." The room was completely still. "I came to the library 2 weeks ago and sat in the back during one of Mr. Hayes' sessions. I told myself I was observing, gathering information for this proposal. But the truth is, I was drawn there. And when I saw all of you openly crying, openly grieving, openly supporting each other, I was angry. Not at you, at myself." Preston's eyes were bright with tears now. "Because I've spent 2 years pretending I'm fine, pretending that loss doesn't touch me, pretending that I can logic and work my way past grief. And seeing your courage made me realize what a coward I've been." He looked directly at Vincent. "Mr. Hayes, I came here tonight prepared to shut down your program. Not because it's inappropriate, but because it terrifies me, because it represents everything I've been running from, because if I allow this program to exist, I have to acknowledge that my own grief exists. And I've been so afraid that if I start feeling it, I'll fall apart completely." Preston wiped his eyes, his composure crumbling. "Catherine loved music. She played violin. And after she died, I got rid of her. Violin gave away all her music because I couldn't stand the reminder. But listening to you play that piano, Vincent, I realized I didn't want to forget. I want to remember, and I want to be brave enough to feel sad about losing her instead of just being angry at the world." The room was silent, except for the sound of people crying quietly. "I'm withdrawing my proposal," Preston said, his voice firm despite the tears. "And I'm asking if you'll have me if I can join your Tuesday sessions. Because I need help, and I should have asked for it a long time ago." For a moment, no one moved. Then Vincent stood and walked over to Preston. He extended his hand, and when Preston took it, Vincent pulled him into an embrace. "Everyone is welcome," Vincent said quietly. "Everyone." The room erupted. People were crying, applauding, hugging each other. Margaret Peterson wiped her own eyes and didn't even try to restore order for several minutes. When the noise finally died down, she called for a vote on a different proposal, one hastily written by David Wilson. A proposal to officially recognize the Melody of Healing as a library program to allocate funds for a new piano and improvements to the space, and to allow Vincent to dedicate Tuesday afternoons to the program as part of his regular duties. The vote was unanimous, 7-0. As the meeting adjourned, people surrounded Vincent, Preston, Dorothy, and the others. The celebration went on for another hour, people sharing stories, making plans, welcoming Preston into the community that had formed around that dusty piano. Vincent found himself standing next to Preston, at one point both of them watching the crowd of people who had come together. "I'm sorry," Preston said quietly, "for trying to shut this down, for being so afraid." "You don't need to apologize," Vincent replied. "Grief makes us do strange things, makes us build walls, makes us push away the very things we need. Believe me, I understand that better than anyone." Preston nodded. "Will you really let me join? Even after everything?" Vincent smiled. "Grief doesn't make you unworthy of healing, Preston, and neither does being scared or making mistakes. That's the whole point of what we're doing. Creating space for all of it, the sadness, the fear, the struggle, the hope, all of it." That Tuesday, Preston Whitmore sat in the circle at the Oak Ridge Public Library for the first time as a participant rather than an observer or an opponent. And when Vincent began to play, Preston finally allowed himself to cry for his Catherine, surrounded by people who understood that tears weren't weakness. They were the beginning of healing. The weeks following the board meeting brought changes to the Oak Ridge Public Library that Vincent never could have imagined when he first answered Dorothy's phone call. The town council approved an increased budget allocation for the library specifically designated for what was now officially called the Melody of Healing program. With those funds, Vincent worked with the board to purchase a beautiful upright piano, not a grand concert instrument, but a quality piece that stayed in tune and had a warm, rich tone. They also renovated the back corner of the library, creating a dedicated space with comfortable seating for up to 40 people, better lighting, and acoustic panels that contained the sound so it wouldn't disturb other patrons. Someone donated a beautiful area rug. Someone else contributed artwork for the walls, peaceful landscapes, and abstract pieces that added warmth to the space. The Tuesday afternoon sessions continued, but they evolved. With Preston's support and connections, Vincent was able to bring in other facilitators. A local art therapist volunteered to lead a Wednesday evening session for people who processed grief better through visual expression. A retired English teacher started a writing circle on Thursday afternoons, where people could journal and share their experiences. Betty, using her nursing background, organized a support group specifically for people dealing with grief-related health issues. Lucas, drawing on his experience losing his father so young, started a group for people in their 20s and 30s, a demographic that often felt forgotten in discussions of grief and loss. The library became a hub for healing in Oak Ridge. And as word spread, people from neighboring towns began showing up. The Tuesday sessions sometimes had 50 or 60 attendees now. Vincent trained a few volunteers, including eventually Preston, to help facilitate when the crowds became too large for one person to manage. Preston's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable. The man who had tried to shut down the program became its most passionate advocate. He spoke at town council meetings about the importance of mental health resources. He personally funded scholarships for people who wanted professional therapy but couldn't afford it. And every Tuesday, he sat in that circle, sometimes sharing, sometimes just listening, gradually learning to carry his grief openly instead of hiding it behind work and rigid control. 6 months after the board meeting, the Melody of Healing program was featured in the state newspaper. The article talked about how a small-town library had become a model for community-based grief support. Vincent received calls from librarians in other states wanting to know how they could start similar programs. "I don't have a formula," he told them. "I just created space. Space where grief didn't have to hide or perform or apologize. Space where music could say what words couldn't. Space where people could be honest about pain and still find hope." The program expanded beyond grief support. Inspired by the Tuesday sessions, the library started other programs focused on different aspects of healing and community building. A gardening group that grew vegetables for the local food bank, a book club specifically for people dealing with chronic illness, a monthly potluck where isolated seniors could find companionship. Dorothy, who had been so broken when she first called Vincent, became a volunteer coordinator for the programs. She had a gift for matching people with the resources they needed, for seeing connections others missed, for creating community out of isolation. Lucas took on an apprentice through the library's new mentorship program, a young man who had lost his father and needed guidance in navigating the world without him. The parallels to Lucas's own story weren't lost on anyone, and watching him pay forward the support he had received was deeply moving. Sarah, now 17 and a senior in high school, started a peer support group for teenagers dealing with grief. She knew firsthand how isolating loss could be at that age, and she was determined that other kids wouldn't feel as alone as she had initially felt. The ripple effects of that first phone call from Dorothy continued to spread through Oak Ridge and beyond. Lives were being changed, connections were being formed, and at the center of it all was Vincent sitting at a piano that was no longer forgotten, creating the soundtrack for a community learning to heal together. But Vincent himself was changing too. The walls he had built around his grief after losing Grace and Daniel were gradually coming down. He found himself able to talk about them more freely, to remember the joy without being overwhelmed by the loss. He even started playing music at home again, something he hadn't done in 8 years. One evening, as he sat at his home piano playing one of Grace's favorite pieces, he felt something shift inside him. Not the end of grief he knew grief didn't end, but a sense of peace. A sense that his loss had been transformed into something that connected him to others rather than isolating him. Grace and Daniel would never come back. That reality would never stop being painful. But through the music, through the community, through the healing, he helped facilitate. Every Tuesday, Vincent had found a way to honor their memory that gave his own life renewed meaning and purpose. The piano, both the one at the library and the one in his home, was no longer a reminder of what he'd lost. It had become a bridge between past and present, between pain and healing, between isolation and community. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, exactly 1 year after Dorothy's first phone call to the library. The space that had once been a dusty corner with a forgotten piano was now transformed into a light-filled sanctuary. 75 people filled the chairs, with more standing along the walls. Vincent, now 75 years old, sat at the piano. His silver hair was perhaps a bit thinner, his hands a bit more weathered, but his eyes held a warmth and peace that hadn't been there a year ago. Beside him sat Preston, who would be sharing facilitation duties today. Dorothy stood near the front, ready to welcome newcomers and make introductions. This was the one-year anniversary celebration of the Melody of Healing program, and the turnout reflected just how much it had grown and how many lives it had touched. Vincent began to play. Not the tentative rusty notes of a year ago, but confident flowing music. He played a medley of pieces, some classical, some contemporary, some that people in the audience had requested over the months, because they reminded them of their lost loved ones. As he played, Vincent looked around the room and saw the journey reflected in the faces watching him. He saw Dorothy, who had gone from barely able to speak about her loss to now leading a widows and widowers support group. She was planning to go back to teaching part-time in the fall, ready to engage with life again, while still honoring Thomas's memory. He saw Lucas, who had brought his new apprentice with him today. The young man had lost his father 6 months ago, and Lucas was providing the mentorship and understanding that he himself had received, the cycle of healing continuing. He saw Betty, who had published an article in a nursing journal about the health benefits of community grief support, citing the Melody of Healing program as a case study. She was working with local healthcare providers to create better referral systems for patients dealing with loss. He saw Sarah, now 18, and preparing for college. She had decided to major in social work, inspired by her experience with the grief support community. She had told Vincent that she wanted to spend her life creating spaces where people felt seen and heard in their pain. And he saw Preston, who had traveled the farthest on his healing journey. The rigid, controlling man who had tried to shut down the program was gone. In his place was someone softer, more open, more willing to be vulnerable. Preston had even started dating again, something he'd sworn he'd never do after Catherine's death. He'd brought his new companion to a session to meet the community that had helped him heal enough to open his heart again. But there were also new faces in the crowd. A young mother who had lost her infant. An elderly man whose partner of 50 years had just passed. A middle-aged woman dealing with the suicide of her adult son. A veteran struggling with the losses he'd experienced in combat. The cycle continued. People came broken, found community, began to heal, and then became the ones who helped others heal. It was beautiful and painful and profoundly human. When Vincent finished playing the medley, he stood to address the gathered crowd. A year ago, he began his voice carrying easily in the attentive silence. I got a phone call that changed my life. Dorothy Campbell called the library, and she asked if she could come sit somewhere quiet because she couldn't be in her own home anymore. She was drowning in grief, and she needed sanctuary. He smiled at Dorothy, who wiped away tears. I could have just said yes. I could have offered her a chair in a corner and gone back to my desk. But something prompted me to do more. Maybe it was the memory of my own grief, my own isolation. Maybe it was the voice of my late wife, who always believed music could heal. Maybe it was just the recognition of pain in another human being, and the desire to ease it in whatever small way I could. Vincent gestured to the piano. This instrument sat forgotten in a corner for 20 years, covered in dust. Silent. And I had been silent too for 8 years after losing my wife and son. Silent in my grief. Hidden. Alone. Because I thought that was the safe way to survive loss. He looked around the room. But this community, all of you, have taught me that silence isn't safety. Isolation isn't protection. We were never meant to grieve alone. We were never meant to hide our pain and pretend we're okay when we're falling apart inside. Vincent's voice grew stronger. Grief is not weakness. It's not something to be ashamed of or to get over as quickly as possible. Grief is love that has nowhere to go. It's the price we pay for connection, for caring, for opening our hearts to others. And the only way through it is together. He paused, letting his words settle. This program has grown beyond anything I imagined. We now have multiple support groups, multiple facilitators' connections to professional resources. We've helped hundreds of people, and I'm so grateful for that. Vincent's eyes grew soft. But more than the numbers, more than the programs, what matters most is this: we've created a space where people don't have to pretend, where tears are welcome, where silence is okay, where you can show up exactly as you are, broken, angry, sad, numb, hopeful, all of it, and you'll be met with understanding rather than judgment. He looked at Preston. We've learned that sometimes the people who seem the strongest, the most put together, are the ones who are most afraid of their own pain. And we've learned that transformation is possible at any age, in any circumstance, when we're willing to be honest about what we're feeling. Vincent sat back down at the piano bench. I want to play one more piece today. It's something my wife Grace loved. For 8 years I couldn't play it because it hurt too much. But now I can play it as a celebration of her life, rather than just a mourning of her death. And that's what healing looks like, not forgetting, not moving on, but learning to carry both the love and the loss together. His fingers found the keys, and a gentle, beautiful melody filled the space. It was bittersweet, both sad and hopeful, both a goodbye and a remembrance. As he played, Vincent thought of Grace and Daniel, of all the music they'd shared, of all the moments of joy that no amount of loss could erase. When the final note faded, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Dorothy stood and said, "Before we break into our small sharing groups, I want to say something. Vincent, you gave me my life back. You gave all of us our lives back. Not by taking away our pain, but by showing us we didn't have to face it alone. Thank you." The room erupted in applause. Vincent smiled, humble and grateful, as people lined up to thank him, to share their stories, to express how much the program had meant to them. As the afternoon continued and people broke into smaller groups to share and support each other, Vincent stood back and observed. This connection, this community, this willingness to sit with pain and transform it through shared vulnerability, this was what libraries were truly for. Not just books and information, but humanity, connection, the creation of space for people to be fully, authentically human. The piano was no longer forgotten. The corner was no longer dusty and neglected. And Vincent Hayes, who had once thought his life was over when he lost his family, had discovered that there was still so much life left to live, still so much love to give, still so much healing to facilitate. As the session wound down and people began to leave, making plans for next Tuesday, hugging each other, exchanging phone numbers, Vincent sat alone at the piano for a moment. He placed his hands on the keys gently, reverently. "We did it, Grace," he whispered. "We brought the music back. We brought healing back. Thank you for never letting me forget what music can do." He played a soft chord, let it ring out into the room, and smiled. The Oak Ridge Public Library still stands at the corner of Oak and Maple, its tall windows still letting in the afternoon light, its shelves still lined with books waiting to be discovered. But now, every Tuesday afternoon, music fills its halls. The Melody of Healing program continues growing and evolving as new people find their way to it, as new facilitators emerge from those who have been healed and want to help others heal. Vincent Hayes is 75 now and he's training others to take over facilitation duties so the program will continue long after he retires. But for now, he's still there every Tuesday, still playing piano, still creating space for grief to be honored and transformed. The model has spread. Libraries in 17 states now have similar programs adapted to their communities, but based on the same principle, creating space for authentic human emotion and connection. Because that's what we need in our isolated modern world. We need places where we can be honest about pain. We need permission to grieve. We need to know that we're not alone in our darkest moments. We need music and community, and the understanding that healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means learning to live fully, even while carrying loss. If this story has touched you, if you've experienced loss, or are supporting someone who has, remember this: your grief matters. Your pain deserves space, and you don't have to carry it alone. There are communities forming everywhere, in libraries, in churches, in community centers, in living rooms, where people are learning to heal together. Find yours, or create one, because the world needs more spaces where vulnerability is welcomed, where tears are honored, where music can say what words cannot. The piano in the Oak Ridge Public Library still plays every Tuesday afternoon, and in the notes that fill that sacred space, there's a message that echoes far beyond the walls of that small-town library we heal together, or we don't heal at all. Thank you for listening to this story. If it resonated with you, there are more stories of hope, healing, and unexpected transformation waiting to be told. Stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Stories that remind us of our shared humanity and our capacity for resilience. Until next time, remember, in each of us lies the power to heal, to connect, to create space for others' pain and our own. And sometimes that power begins with something as simple as playing a forgotten piano in a dusty corner and being brave enough to let the music fill the silence. The melody of healing plays on in Oak Ridge, and it can play on wherever you are too.